Hey everybody, I'm here before round 1 of Ka0s Treasure Series 9, and today I am playing a deck that I had a vote for over on Twitter. It is a deck I am calling My Precious. The winning vote there was for a Turbo One Ring deck, and it was already the deck I was sort of leaning towards, but yeah, here we have this deck I call My Precious. Basically, the idea is you get Derevi out and you get a one ring, and that will allow you to untap it a bunch and draw a ridiculous amount of cards, which is pretty exciting. Apart from that, there's a lot of combos in this deck, a lot of very strange layered ways to win the game. Derevi's kind of biggest struggle historically has been the ability to actually close a game out, so we'll see how I do in today's tournament. I'm feeling really good about the deck. I've been playing it a few games this week, and it's actually been doing pretty well for me, but we'll see how consistent it's able to run today. I'll be doing more of a breakdown of the deck after the tournament section. Either way, this is before round 1 of this tournament. I'm very excited about this deck, and it's definitely been some of the most fun I've had brewing in quite some time, so excited to see where it'll go, and I'll catch y'all after round 1. Okay, so I'm coming back to you after round 1. I was able to take the win there. I got a little bit lucky because they had paired round 1 and I was in 4th seat, and then somebody messed up and they had to repair, and then I ended up in 1st seat with a completely different pod. So that was a little bit of luck in my favor for sure. I also was a little unlucky because I was finally going to get to play a game with your Priscilla, who's someone I've coached and talked with for a while, and I haven't gotten to play a tournament game with them, and I was excited about it. But that was a round of literally all like 2014 commanders. So it was me on 1st seat on Derevi, Scion of the Ur-Dragon in 2nd seat, and Gitrog in 3rd seat, and in 4th seat was Captain cEDH. So it was a lot of like grind engines back and forth kind of stuff. There were multiple attempts at culling rituals cast in that game. I was like starting to do some really cool stuff with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Derevi. I took one of Captain cEDH's Yisons that was in the graveyard, which was pretty cool, and I only got to activate that once before the culling ritual happened, and then I lost my Soul Cauldron. And then eventually the thing that dug me out finally was being able to transmute for the one ring. I drew, the last activation was for 10, so yeah, whatever 10 factorial is. And so I drew a lot of cards off of that, which was pretty sick, and yeah, it definitely pulled me out of the game. I eventually won with the Deadeye Navigator loop, where I have Deadeye Navigator, Derevi, and I guess I could have done Chromatic Ori, but I could have done it with a number of other different outlets as well. And then I drew my deck, did the Blind Obedience thing, won the game. I'm realizing I am short a win con in the deck because I'm like, oh, well, Finale is a win con in the list, but technically speaking, Finale doesn't really work fantastically with the deck because of the real inability to win post-combat, which is, with Derevi, like, you're going to combat actually a lot. So I'm definitely realizing it's kind of a flaw with the deck. I think Angel's Grace will just be that alternate win con, so that way if I have a Fairy Mastermind, I can just draw everybody's decks and kill them with Angel's Grace in response, and that way it actually opens up an instant speed line as well. So I kind of beefed that one before even signing up for the tournament today. The winning of the game is the hardest part in Derevi, and I think, you know, it's being clearly kind of shown with this variant. I eventually won with Blind Obedience lines, but definitely starting to realize there's a little bit of a flaw with the deck as far as that's concerned. So that's something to be thinking about as I'm going through this process. But yeah, all in all, deck's been doing pretty well, and happy to be able to start this tournament 1-0. Alright, so I am here after round 2, and that was perhaps one of the craziest rounds of Magic I have ever played in my entire life. So the place we left it at was, I started in 4th seat, going with a hand that was down to 4 cards. Land, a Mana Crypt, a Felwar Stone, and I believe, well, it's a Phyrexian Metamorph, so I know like I can copy something hopefully to get out of that place. I have Shalai Halar, seat 1, I have Obnixilis, seat 2, and I have Magda, seat 3. This is also after round 3 because I didn't get enough time to record, so I'm a little hazy on some of the details, but then as I go to pass my first turn, Shalai Halar untaps, plays Karn. And we're at a place where, like, there's no way this Karn's ever going off, and Karn immediately nukes my Mana Crypt, right? So I'm quasi out of this game forever. I top deck a land the turn after that, and after, like, 2 or 3 turns after that, I get a Sylvan Library, which is the only way that I'm even playing this game at all. The Sylvan Library draws are pretty hot garbage for a while. There's a lot of stuff where Magda swinging in actually pulls out a Phyrexian portal to wipe the board. Shalyn Halar has a lot of control over the board and has to recast Shalyn Halar a bunch of times. And Obnixilus is just stuck on land drops because basically everyone but Magda mulled down to 5. Well, it was 5, 5. Second 7, and I was at 4. So everybody mulls into oblivion. This game is just like a slog. It's like as soon as anyone gets anything, Magda was like constantly running away with the game, and it kept being a game of like, okay, maybe I get a Rhystic Study and eventually pull back into it, or if I'm doing the Sylvan Library thing, but mostly Magda ahead. Then Shalyn Halar occasionally looked like they were getting a little ahead, but Magda was very much dominant the whole game. Obnixilus finally can play a spell. They play a Roiling Vortex, which starts chipping away at lives. I am losing so much life to Sylvan Library because I just have to clear the top because it's all like 6 drops and tutors and stuff like that, and things like I can't cast into their current board state. I play a Rhystic and I start to get a little bit of advantage, and then Magda drops a Magus of the Moon, and so I am back to being out of the game until turns later I finally get a Chromatic Orrery, and meanwhile I am down to I think like 7 life at this point. I'm like very, very low, and there's this Roiling Vortex, which is just doing 1 to me every single turn. I can't cast any spells, so I tap out for the Chromatic Orrery. Meanwhile, there's also 3 Phyrexian portals on the field at the moment. Magda has 2 of them, and I use my Metamorph to copy Magda's Phyrexian portal to stop them basically winning several turns earlier. So we're just like reanimating what very few creatures are in the graveyard, and it's gumming up the board, and so like people will be trading in combat and then bringing the thing back. But the thing is, Magda's always go off first, so these always going to have, and there's 2 of them, right? So he's always going to have more selection over the stuff. So eventually we get to the point where I am able to untap with the Orrery, and I get silenced in my upkeep. And I do not have anything to fight over the silence, and because the artifacts are still shut off, right? So I have exactly 7 mana. So eventually I Sylvan Library and look at the top 3, and it's basically a Miri's Guile at this point. I'm not drawing any extra cards. I'm just like looking at top 3, taking the best one, right? So in a row, I have the Orrery, and then I get a Cyclonic Rift. So I get silenced in my upkeep. I pass the turn, which is fine. I just literally just pass the turn, go to clean up all that stuff. And once again, I'm still at 1 life. We make it all the way back to Magda's end step, where there is not enough attackers for Magda to come kill me. Plus, Obnixilus flips into, like, finally Obnixilus hits the board in the last turn cycle of the game, and they flip into the all will be 1 combo card. So everyone just immediately goes on high alert, right? We're ready for this combo to jump down at literally any second. So that really changes the dynamic of that last second turn, and then Magda passes with basically the idea that they're probably going to either A, we're going to stall out and go to time, or B, they're probably going to untap and win their next turn. In that end step, I crank out the Cyclonic Rift. There is no interaction from my opponents, and I'm able to flash in Derevi at that point and start using my Chromatic Orrery to make a bunch of mana. I play a Deadeye Navigator on my turn, and I draw my whole deck, and I'm able to get there with that one. So that was the craziest game I think I've ever played with, a Roiling Vortex about to kill me on my upkeep at 1 life, able to rip the Psych Rift and get there. So definitely, a well-navigated game from all 3 of my opponents, especially with 3 of us being at such deficits at the start of the game, and very stacks heavy, but definitely a little bit of luck, a little bit of skill with that one. But yeah, I was able to get that at 1 life, and ended up being a pretty crazy match. After round 3, the weird part about this is that because of how many draws there were in the last pod, it's myself and 2 other undefeated players, and we actually have a person who is 1 win, 0 losses, and 1 draw. So it's definitely going to throw the numbers for the tournament into a lot of craziness, right? But right now where we're at is that there are a bunch of people with a bunch of draws and a bunch of wins. At this point, I'm playing against Tana Tevesh in seat 1, Corvold in seat 2, myself in seat 3, and then we have Kenrith in seat 4. I open up with a Delighted Halfling and then a Faber Elder for my second turn. I'm holding up Legolas's Quick Reflexes as a way to protect my Faber Elder in case anyone thinks that I'm a problem. Tana Tevesh kind of half goes off into Kenrith having a Rhystic Study and an Esper Sentinel. They try to play Dockside into a Cloudstone Curio. We know Corvold has just Demonic Tutor on their last turn, missed land drop, said something about getting mana. So we're like, okay, they probably have Dockside, but they only have a green-black land. Tana Tevesh tries to go off. They play the Dockside. They play Skull Clamp. They play Cloudstone Curio. Cloudstone Curio gets countered by Kenrith. We go to Corvold's turn. Corvold Demonic Tutors again after Noxious Revival, putting it back on top. they get their land, they play the dockside for 6. So there's 4 out of Kenrith, 2 out of Tana Devesh, and I had 0 things that fed dockside. But they made 6 off of that, and then Corvold follows up with a Saw in half, making 12 treasures, and then begins the slow progression of the game, basically ending as we are bleeding out. Corvold having 12 treasures and whatnot. Corvold comes down, draws a bunch of cards. We get to a point where I Legolas's quick reflexes to untap our Tana Devesh player's Deathrite Shaman to at least be able to hold them off trying to loop things in the graveyard, which was good because it sort of threw the Corvold player off a little bit and like made their line go a little longer, but eventually they figured out a way out of it because they kept drawing like Reanimate the Dockside and Skirk to sack the things and bring it back, and like it was crazy. So we lost to a mountain of treasures from Corvold, and sometimes that happens if you let Corvold have a high dockside count. So on to round 4 and 5. I think there's a chance I just try and and the craziest part about that match is that the person who won was our player who had 1 win and 1 draw. So now there are 0 undefeated players in this entire tournament, and I think that means that the players who lost the last round can just draw in to the top 16, which is, I believe, where we're at. So I'm going to try and do that. All right, so pod 4, I was able to get there. It was a very, very grindy game. How to even describe this game? So it's myself, first seat. In second seat, we have Nibar on Gyruda, who's like been the person pushing Gyruda for a while. Third seat, we have Sisay, and in fourth seat, we have Rayhan Crom deck that Priscilla took the top 4 of Mox Masters. So a little all over the place with the pod, like definitely like 4-color Reanimator in the bottom. We got Sisay doing the normal Sisay stuff, right? And then Nibar being like very scary with this Gyruda deck because I never know if it's like one trigger is going to just win the game or like, it's kind of crazy like that. So it's always weird playing against that deck because I'm like, oh, it could just win, or also it could whiff, but it also could just win the game, but it could whiff, It was a very grindy game. I was able to get Derevi out, turn 1 Bloom Tender, turn 2 tap Derevi into a Shorikai, and the Shorikai was doing a lot of good work for me, so that was pretty strong as far as that was concerned. It was drawing me a bunch of cards, but eventually there was a Bowmasters that came out of Rayhan Crom, and that was just sniping away all my blockers, all my 1/1 pilots. It just like Bowmasters was hitting me really, really hard. The only things that were able to survive on my board pretty much the entire game were Toski, which is indestructible, and Derevi itself, because there was a certain amount of like, okay, it doesn't really matter because you can just activate Derevi's ability and put it back in the field, right? So there's a lot of crazy turns there. There was an entire turn cycle where I'm locked out from Opposition Agent. I have like 2 artifacts and 3 tutors in my hand and a hand of 6. Even though I'm like drawing a bunch of Shorikai, I'm just like filtering into nothing basically. And once again, we're locked into this Opposition Agent. You have a turn cycle where basically like Gyruda goes for it, Sisay goes for it, Rayhan Crom goes for it, and like going for it for Rayhan Crom was like trying to get a Consecrated Sphinx out. It ate the Force of Will in my hand. We get through slog of a board state again and again. Eventually I draw a Cyclonic Rift, and that's like kind of my answer to get out of the situation. I try to overload it. Gyruda then responds by overloading their own Cyclonic Rift. I try to counter their Cyclonic Rift, and then Sisay counters my Cyclonic Rift, so no Cyclonic Rift resolve, but then I had the path to be able to sneak in, get rid of the Opposition Agent. Go to my turn, got there with the combination of Gaia's Cradle and having exactly 4 creatures, 1 from Shorikai, Emil, Derevi, and Toski, which was like exactly the amount of creatures I needed to be able to make infinite mana. Filtered that into a Phyrexian Metamorph, which then became a clone of the Bowmasters, so I didn't die to my own Bowmasters, and then or I didn't die to Rayhan Crom's Bowmasters, and then I drew my entire deck with Shorikai by untapping it infinitely with the Derevi thing, winning with the Blind Obedience blind. So that part was pretty good. Another situation where having Angel's Grace in the deck probably would have saved me, which is not fantastic, but kind of it is what it is. So I'm definitely going to be adding that card in a slot when it comes to next tournament I play with this deck. Wondering if, because Legolas's Quick Reflexes is like kind of a similar role where it's like a niche interactive piece that has split second and like hard to deal with, but I'm not really sure where the spot is for that card. Legolas has also won me a game earlier because of the split second ability on it, so it's like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. It's a little weird. That all being said, it was a crazy win, and I am going to be 3-1 going into the last round of Swiss, which should lock me in for top 16. So I'm gonna sit with my pod and attempt to just draw it in, and if I have to play, I'd be very surprised, but I don't really know what the breakers are with everybody right now. So we had the juxtaposition of ending the Swiss in first seat. So what happened in that round 5 is I was paired up against Freedom Waffle and Wooded Satellite and Ardeen, and we all had really good records, so we agreed to draw, meaning that I got the top record going in, leaving the Swiss and going into the top 16. Unfortunately, I then played my semifinals match and punted away a win, which really sucks. I got a little stuck on lands going first. I was doing like some pretty okay Derevi stuff. We had Kinnan, who we sort of got into a political discussion where they agreed to get a Thorn Mammoth out pretty early to stop Tivit, who had a Grand Abolisher, which was good for us. Unfortunately, then the Thorn Mammoth also kept like sniping off my value creatures as well. Game sort of got really grindy. Tivit and Kinnan were kind of like going back and forth, and it basically leveraged into a situation in which we went to my turn, and I had a couple tutors, I had Grand Abolisher, and I had Emil, and I went for a line where I was going to copy Tivit, but I completely forgot that there was a Dauntless Dismantler on the field, so instead of getting 4 mana if I copied Tivit, I would instead get nothing because all of my treasures would come in taps. And if I had just not gone for like the safe play and gone for the Grand Abolisher into the Tivit first, I would have been able to play Emil and go for the win. So with the way it worked out, I ended up exactly 1 mana short. And then we passed around the table. It got to Tivit, who then went for a Time Sieve win, had the Time Sieve blown up, and then untapped next turn, played Savines, and got Time Sieve back. So definitely a tough loss. I haven't really punted like that in a major tournament in a really long time. Goes to show you that it happens to everybody. I think because I ended Swiss in first, I'll at least come in 5th. So there's a little bit of consolation on that one. Yeah, not my favorite result that I've had in a little bit. It was sad. I think the deck was doing pretty well. And, I was kind of hoping to at least take it to the top 4, maybe win on camera, but my only 2 featured matches today I ended up losing. So yeah, I don't know if there's some correlation there. Derevi was really fun to play. It was surprisingly pretty powerful. It put a lot of wins on the table. I was like pushing for wins pretty early on, so I was really happy with the deck. Not happy with how I ended that last round, but at the end of the day, it was really fun and definitely a deck I will keep playing because it's pretty sweet and kind of weird and quirky. So hello and welcome everybody. This is the deck tech of my Derevi list that I took the top 16 of Ka0s IX that had I not punted I would have taken to the top 4 of Ka0s Treasure IX. But yeah, this is my Derevi list, and to be honest, it is one of the brews in cEDH that I think I'm the most proud of in my entire career. There's very few times where I feel like I've made a deck that can truly feel like an innovation on something that's already existed and existed for a long time. But yeah, I think the closest deck to this one on the database right now is 34 cards different, and that's the closest one. I think the other one's like 40 cards different. So definitely a very different Derevi deck, and really fun deck to play. Kind of difficult, as you can tell by my mentioning that I did punt a big win off of this one, but really fun. And I definitely I knew the deck was pretty decent, but did not expect to be first in Swiss standings with this deck that is considered pretty outdated at this point. Before we go into this, just remember, while you're here on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button, helps out the channel a ton. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg, where you can do things like receive coaching from myself, which we can talk about a little bit later in this deck tech. So this is my Derevi list, My Precious. So the name of this deck obviously is a reference to Lord of the Rings vis-a-vis the One Ring. So the idea of this list was to be a turbo the One Ring deck. And the idea there, Derevi is insane with the One Ring. You are able to connect with every single creature that hits. You're basically able to untap the One Ring. So say you have One Ring out, you drew the 1 card per turn. As comes down, you can tap it, right? Hit with Derevi, draws 2, right? So now this conversion of 4 mana for draw 3 is insane, right? You have any other creatures, then suddenly that turns into a draw 6 in a single turn, and then just exponentially grows from that point, right? Now many people will not want to let you have that. That is not an interaction that people enjoy losing to, right? So, and the reason I think this deck is real and has legs is because the fact that I saw it the One Ring, I think I've played 10 games with this deck in total, if not a few more. I've seen the One Ring 3 times. with the deck, and it still has something like an 80% win rate. Now, obviously, it's a little bit high, right? If I have more and more games testing this deck, I don't think the win rate would look nearly as insane as that, right? But I had a very good run going into this tournament. I guess 80% is probably a little bit high. I think it's probably like 60 or 70, but a very high win rate for a deck that's, supposedly built around one card particularly, but doesn't even have to have that, right? So let's go through and talk about some other stuff. The big thing here, I think, worth mentioning is that we are on 23 creatures, right? Which, 23 creatures is still a decent amount of creatures, but when you consider what Derevi normally looks like, right? Let's pop over to the historical lists of Derevi, the current database ones as we'll go through. So we have 36 here for the Bird Wizard list and 30 here for the Spellpod Derevi list, right? So immediately significantly less creatures than these other lists, right? Because we're not doing a lot of the things that get, eaten up by Bowmasters in the current metagame, right? That is a card I'm trying to avoid losing to. Now, does that mean that we have less things that trigger Derevi? Absolutely it does, right? But the things that we do choose to invest into, we're really only creating scenarios where we're not trying to untap a thing 8, 9, 10, 11 times, right? We're just trying to untap it 3 or 4 times, take control of the game, and push our advantage from there, right? So, and a lot of the deck is resilient to something like Bowmasters, right? We have cards like Mastermind and Bloom Tender and Noble and Birds of Paradise and Esper Sentinel that do, they're X1s, right? They get pinged down. But we have, things like Emil, which is a 4/4, and Ranger Captain, and Kutsil, and Derevi itself, right? Like the amount of times, or even Toski, right? Like an indestructible 1/1. These things take multiple triggers of Bowmasters to be able to, have your whole board shot down. And the fact that Derevi itself has this insane activated ability where it gets around commander attacks and can be flashed in instant speed. I literally had instances playing this deck where my opponents have been like, yeah, I could shoot down Derevi, but there's literally no point because he has enough mana to just instant speed activate, put it right back on the battlefield, and nothing's changed, right? That part of this card is quite good, and it's definitely not to be underestimated. Not to mention the fact that I would watch people play a Dragon's Magistrate and I'd be like, cool. I guess for my first Derevi out of the command zone, I have to wait for 1 more mana, and I'll just hold up an instant speed activation. Also, the fact that Derevi often just refunds itself immediately. Like you have 1 creature out, you play Derevi, untap your land, attack with that creature, untap your land. Now suddenly you're holding up interaction going into your next turn after you've invested in your commander for turn, right? And that's like the worst case scenario with these cards. So how are we being anti-Bowmaster? So I think that to explain that, we are down here to the artifacts, right? This is a 17 artifact Derevi list, right? We've mentioned a couple of them before, specifically the One Ring. We should talk about Birthing Pod effects, which we'll talk about later. I know traditionally there have been as you look into some of these other versions, right, there are lines with like Preston the Vanisher and Felidar Guardian where you can basically activate Pod on Derevi once, and through Preston and some of these other cards, assemble a win con without basically casting any other cards apart from Derevi and Pod. The problem I see with those is that line involves a bunch of dead cards and is not fantastic. So Pod and Neoform and Eldritch Evolution and things like that in this list are kind of broken by the fact that, once again, Derevi gets around that commander tax ability, and one of our main combo enablers in the list is Emil, right? And so the ability for all of those things to be able to pot up 1 level and get Emil, and then, set up any number of our combos, which we'll go over in a minute because there's a lot of really weird layered combos in this deck. But the important ones to know, I think pretty obviously, are like Deadeye Navigator and Emil, and we can talk about all the different things that they combo with in a minute here. We have our normal like ramp artifacts, right? Like this artifact mana base definitely looks a lot more like something like a Rogside than it normally does to a standard Derevi, right? But we have Mox Amber, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, right? Mox Amber is so free because we have our commander consistently at all times, right? And we have things like Grim Monolith, which are actually combo pieces, as well as Mana Vault, which is a combo piece, which we'll talk about in a second, right? So I guess with these particularly, it's pretty easy with not only the fact that we're playing Kinnan in the 99 to enable a bunch of combos that aren't normally combos, right? But the fact that other people are playing Kinnan and we're playing Flesh Duplicate and Phyrexian Metamorph to be able to copy other people's Kinnans as combo pieces, or at least like pieces to combos, I should say. They're not, specifically a combo piece on its own. One of the big downsides of Derevi combos is that you can get infinite mana and then you have nothing to do with it, right? But having Kinnan in the deck is one of those ways that you can filter out your infinite mana to actually do something. Now, one card that I do want to put in the deck, basically immediately, that I feel like was a mistake not to play in the list, is Angel's Grace, which I know is a bit of an odd card in general and not a card most people play. I'll pull that up right now. But specifically, the split-second ability to say we can't lose the game. One, very good defensive tool against Thoracle and things like that. But specifically, the ability to... It opens up an instant speed line with the deck where if you have Fairy Mastermind, you can Angel's Grace and then have everybody draw their decks, and you won't lose the game because you have Angel's Grace out this turn, and your opponents will draw their decks, and they will lose the game. And it's a very clean instant speed line, so you can just draw until you get the Angel's Grace, cast the Angel's Grace, make everybody draw themselves in response to whatever they're doing, right? They can't really put other things in the stack because of the way Angel's Grace works, and it's a very clean win. Once again, it just opens up a lot of lines, because, during the tournament, I was doing things like, okay, I'll get Kinnan, then I will get Eternal Witness plus Emil, and I'll have like a loop of recurring stuff, and then I would have Blind Obedience plus Lotus Petal. Now, ironically, the way that I think I've won the most with this deck is, once again, you need that outlet to be able to make the infinite flickers, infinite mana thing actually a kill, right? Because you can always tap down your opponent's mana sources on their upkeep every single turn, but there are actually a lot of ways to get around that. Basically, like, they can float a bunch of mana and kill Derevi in response, right? Which is just a generally like awful thing for our strategy, right? So that's not what we want to be doing, and we don't want to be losing to stuff like that. Or specifically, they can untap and kill Emil, specifically because Emil can't flicker itself, right? So once again, cards like Kinnan allow you to go get cards like Fairy Mastermind, draw your whole deck, and draw your opponents out of their decks. You also have a bunch of stuff like you can untap the One Ring, draw cards from there. You can untap Chromatic Orrery, draw 3 cards at a time with that one. You can untap Shorokai. There's a lot of different ways to convert that, right? So in this deck, I guess going back to the artifacts, we're jumping a lot over the place, but because of the fact that this deck is so layered on top of one another, right? Like, there's so many things that bleed into itself. Explaining how to like actually win with the deck is sort of this complicated process. And that's one of the reasons that I think this deck has suffered historically, is that Derevi is a list that is difficult. I mean, it is difficult to actually win the game with, right? Like the line I just described to you where, I can tap down all my opponent's stuff on their upkeeps, is not actually winning the game, and it creates scenarios where there's like holes where your opponents can respond to stuff you're doing, right? They can silence you, they can play mana rocks and lands afterwards, and then they can maybe go for a win, right? Which is obviously very bad for us, right? There are wins that can be presented that Derevi can't stop, right? So that's why we need these outlets, and which is why the deck has struggled historically, and why we're playing a card like Chromatic Orrery, which is objectively not a good card, right, on a base level, but it opens up so many cleaner combos in the deck that it's worth it, right? Chromatic Orrery plus any of our flickerers, right? So Deadeye, plus Derevi plus Orrery, or Emil plus Derevi plus Orrery is not only infinite mana, but it's also infinite iterations of draw 3 cards, right? Which will then actually lead to our clean win conditions that we have here in the deck. There's also Spellseeker lines, which, were originated through this Spellpod Derevi list. Once again, that list is doing Vanisher, all that kind of nonsense. But with Spellseeker in this list, you can go get Ephemery, which, if I'm being honest, I haven't really gone for this line a ton in the deck. I think this line is a little bit better if you're going for one of those like slower stacks of your Derevi lists. This deck, I want to be able to turn the corner and win in 1 turn, and this combo is a 2-turn combo without the ability to like take an extra turn through something like Final Fortune. Spellseeker might still earn its inclusion because it's a really good birthing pod target, and it's good to like go grab Neoform to go get Emil or Sisay or Metamorph or Toski or something like that. So like it's earned its spot, but the Ephemerate line in particular is pretty mediocre. But what you do is you get Spellseeker, you grab Ephemerate, you cast Ephemerate on Spellseeker, you go grab your Crop Rotation goes and grabs your Gaia's Cradle, right? Next turn, Ephemerate comes back, you flicker the Spellseeker one more time, you go grab Neoform, put Neoform into Emil the Blessed, and then you have Derevi plus Cradle plus Crop Rotation, and then hopefully you have 2 other creatures to be able to make infinite mana and get those infinite activations, right? But as I mentioned, very few times am I actually really going for this Ephemerate line because it's very telegraphed. It's very obvious when it's happening, and I just found that like I would just, in a lot of circumstances, just grab Spellseeker, go grab Neoform, turn it into an Emil, and then just try and win the game that turn with many other layered combos, right? I feel like that line in particular is better without as much layering as we have in here. So I mentioned earlier, Kinnan's kind of busted in the deck, right? Now with Fabro Elder and Bloom Tender plus Deadeye, right, that's always going to be infinite mana on the deck, or infinite green and white mana, and eventually that can transition into something like other combos in the list. But with Kinnan, it allows you to, create a loop where you're flickering the infinite, and you're not just making infinite white and green, you're making infinite blue as well, which then allows you to do infinite Deadeye flickers for other stuff, right? Which is pretty powerful. But Kinnan also then makes, once again, the Mana Vault in your Grim Monolith also tap for 4, right? So your Emil combos are then suddenly able to generate infinite mana that way. And then Emil plus Bloomtender and Fabro if they're making 4 mana, once again with Kinnan. So Kinnan really just adds a bunch of mana for all of these enablers here and sort of like doubles up the amount of potential infinite combos, if not quadruples up the amount of potential infinite combos in the deck. So Kinnan obviously very, very strong in this list. We have Grand Abolisher and Kutzil here, as just, how they are. They're here to protect our wins, and in a deck like this, it's very creature-focused, very, very good for that purpose. Captain Sisay gets Gaia's Cradle, gets Emil, is like the main ones that it gets, but it gets Kinnan, it gets the One Ring, right? There's so many legendary permanents that are relevant for this deck that it's a very, very good card. Obviously, it's a 2/2 for 4 mana, so it's a little squishy. In the semifinals, I played it and had it immediately eat into Kinnan's Thorn Mammoth. It happens sometimes, but if you get to untap with the card, remembering once again that Derevi untaps a bunch of different stuff, right? So you can usually assemble entire combos in one turn with Sisay plus Derevi, right? Okay, back to the artifacts. We'll talk about some of the spicier ones. We have Agatha's Soul Cauldron here, very good when combined with your Fabro Elders, or if you lose your Fairy Masterminds, or your Captain Sisays, or your Emils, or your Deadeye Navigators. If you're noticing, a lot of our important cards in this deck have these activated abilities. So yeah, the Agatha's Soul Cauldron is actually a giant MVP in the deck, and it's a tap ability, right? So you can, with Derevi, be able to exile multiple things out of graveyards and put multiple counters on Derevi, and actually had one game where I had a 5/6 Derevi flying around, actually acting as a clock and a protection piece to stop me from losing in the air to like a Crom and beating down one of my other opponents. So that part was pretty cool. I think Shurikai is one of the spiciest cards in the deck, and also one of the best cards in the deck by a good amount. I mean, it's sort of like One Ring at home, right? But it has its own benefits too, right? So it's card advantage. You draw 2, discard 1, so you're netting a card and having an extra card of card selection. It's making you that 1/1 pilot, right? Which is, we mentioned, this is a lower creature count Derevi list, so the fact that this is making you cards and it's providing bodies so that you can get in for combat damage and start untapping things with Derevi is really good, right? Because, your creatures like Esper Sentinel and Dauntless Dismantler and Spellseeker and Kinnan and Grand Abolisher, it's hard to get all of those creatures in for combat damage, and earn your mana dorks too, right? But if you have just this stream of 1/1s coming in, able to swing turn after turn, like, doesn't matter if they all get sniped to Bowmasters, you're just going to combat next turn and making a bunch more. So Shurikai definitely a big role player in the deck, and one that I think was very, very powerful as I go to the tournament. I mean, obviously we talked about the One Ring, right? One of the reasons to be playing this deck, very, very powerful at doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is just converting Derevi activations to winning the game, right? If you get a turn or 2 of this card, usually 2 turns of the One Ring, you win the game, because it's, at that point, it's probably drawing you like 6 the first turn and then like 14 the second turn. It gets very, very, very much out of hand. And especially if you have more things to trigger Derevi, right? Legless's Quick Reflexes, very powerful. Split Second won me the game during the Swiss of the tournament at one point. It was just uncounterable removal spell, which got me the exact combat damage I needed to kill one player, and then, untap Derevi exactly when I needed to. So very, very powerful at doing exactly that. And then we have a bunch of tutors here for artifacts, right? We've got Transmute Artifact, Wargate, Tezzeret the Seeker, we have Enlightened Tutor, right? All, and Word of Invention, just a ton of ways to go grab our One Ring. And if that game plan isn't working, we're doing the creature combo stuff, right? We're doing the Deadeye and the Emil, and ironically, I have, we're talking about outlets and how it's needed to convert, these infinite mana sequences to actually winning the game. I have converted, infinite blinks with Emil and Deadeye after generating infinite mana into copying my opponent's Bowmasters with either Metamorph or Flesh Duplicate so many times. I mean, what you do is you basically, right, you kill the other 2 players who don't have the Bowmaster, and then you kill the player who has the Bowmaster. It's pretty simple sequencing at that point, right? But it's a really quick way to actually end the game, and ironically, your opponent's Bowmasters is one of the best outlets you have in this deck. But yeah, the deck's actually surprisingly resilient, and I think, once again, Derevi's activated ability combined with the fact that it generates just so much mana is one of the things that makes this deck like actually way more viable than it initially appears, right? You're able to just like hit your opponents, generate a ton of mana, untap, go for your tutors. I mean, the toughest part is your lack of card advantage, right? But that's kind of why the deck has like a bunch of different layered ways of like making that happen, right? You have your things like cEDH, which is just like one card tutor multiple combo pieces, right? You have your clones, which are copying Tymnas and Kroms and sometimes even more heavy card advantage cards, right? You have your Toskis there for a bunch of card draw. Once again, indestructible, really big on this card. Just doing a lot of different things to provide yourself a decent amount of value that, you know, is allowing you to like draw out of tough situations, and you know, the ton of tutors to get you into your Shorikai in one ring, obviously, which converts to a win. Chromatic Orrery as well, pretty easily. And you have your Blind Obediences and your Dauntless Dismantlers here to deal with the fact that your opponents have a bunch of different artifacts and they're playing them against you. And then you're trying to leverage all of that to convert that all into a win. Definitely a different type of Derevi deck, and I'm pretty proud of this list. It was really, really cool to play. I really enjoyed playing it a lot. You know, if you're picking up the deck, don't be afraid to neoform your Derevi into an Emil and then just recast it out of the command zone. I think it's like one of the cleanest play patterns in the whole deck, and it's something you kind of have access to all the time. I definitely, when I played the list, was not expecting it to lead me to a first place standing in the Swiss and then, you know, almost bring me to the finals of the tournament, you know, without my own player error. So really, really cool deck. I really enjoyed playing it, as I said, and yeah, it was very, very fun to play this weekend, and definitely, you know, playing this very explosive tempo version of Derevi is definitely a little bit off axis. Something people don't have training against it. People don't know how to handle that play pattern, and it's a little bit weird. And you know, the list isn't like turboing out super quick wins. It is more the fact that it just grinds pretty well with a number of engines that exist in the deck, because, you know, it's designed to have a bunch of different ways to convert all of these untaps into just boom, I win the game, right? So a lot of different ways to be able to make that known. But yeah, the deck's pretty cool. The rest of the stuff's just like a lot of, you know, high value cards in the list, and you know, some card draw, you know, things like Remora's Library, Heuristic Study, all of that stuff, right? You don't have the card advantage of the command zone, so you're kind of making up for that with the rest of the deck. But yeah, the deck's been super fun to brew, super fun to play. As I mentioned, it's one of the things I'm most proud of that I've brewed in a really long time, because it's so different than all of the other stuff I'm seeing for Derevi kind of out there right now, and very glad to have brought it to this tournament. Being as proud as I am of this deck, I probably will definitely play it again at a tournament sometime soon, but I also don't want it to be, you know, something that just like gets a bunch of heat when it can't really take, you know, the most heat in the entire world, for sure. But yeah, I like the deck a lot, and, you know, for anyone who really likes this commander, because I think that's the cool part about Derevi, it's like a very appealing commander in general, but it's sort of hard to build in the current metagame. And so for anyone who's really trying to give this deck a spin, I think this list is something that can put up surprising results. I genuinely was even surprised with my own performance with the deck. I think it's pretty solid. You know, if you also are interested in cEDH coaching from the person who took this super outdated deck and brought it to the top 16 of a major cEDH tournament, it was one of my many top finishes this year, and I'm very happy to hopefully get, this is either my last tournament of the year, or maybe I can sneak one in right before New Year's Eve. But yeah, definitely excited to keep doing cEDH. It feels good to go back to my brewing roots. But if you're interested in stuff like that, in the description down below is all my information on cEDH coaching. You have my email, comedianmtg@gmail.com. You'll find me on Discord or Twitter, any of those places, which once again are all in the description down below. Thank you all for watching this video. Leave comments down below. What's the most interesting card in this deck for you guys? I know a lot of people commented on Orrery. I know many people commented on Shorikai. But what's the weirdest card for y'all in this deck? And without any further ado, I'll catch y'all next time. Peace.
Afraid to turn out the lights? Is there something you're scared of? What's there out in the dark? Make sure to keep all your windows locked. Do you surrender? You try to stay awake. These walls you can't escape. Here's one for the lonely hearts, for the ones that fear the dark. You better run now, run. run from the broken road.